Hello, and welcome to the Revit Users Learning ARCHICAD course. We at Graphisoft are providing you with this information to help make the adjustment process go a little smoother. You will find that we have provided some content that you can download to also help you with the transitioning process. We have included an agenda with an overview of the content that we are covering today. Please use this to take notes if that is helpful to you. There should also be a document with a terminology overview of ARCHICAD to Revit, as well as an explanation of each of the tools inside of ARCHICAD. We aren't going to go over all of the elements in the list, but cover the important aspects of the program to consider. This course is copyrighted, so please don't copy or distribute any of this content without the consent of Graphisoft. Hopefully, everyone is able to see and hear me. If not, and you're attending by computer or phone, hang up and call back again. I want to make sure that everyone is able to log on, so we are just going to hold here for a little bit. I also wanted everyone to know that sometimes there may be bad internet connection, which can also cause video or audio issues. For those of you who aren't too familiar with Graphisoft and who we have been developing BIM since 1982. We try to make our software as flexible as possible for the users, and so our software is available on both Mac and PC platforms. We are also present in more than 110 countries, have over 30 localized versions of ARCHICAD, and are available in over 20 languages. This course was created to help with the software transitioning process. There are always challenges that one faces when working with different software, and so to help, we are going to propose a different workflow to ease the adjustment. Hopefully, by the end of this course, you will feel more comfortable with ARCHICAD and see everything that this program has to offer. In order for you to better see and understand the steps I am taking, we have these visual aids, which should indicate the clicks I am making with my mouse, as well as the keyboard buttons that I am using. Today's course is broken up into 4 parts. It is set up so that you will get a general understanding of the ARCHICAD interface, a general understanding of the different tools in ARCHICAD, an overview of the navigator and how it compares to Revit's project browser, and an explanation of the different view settings in ARCHICAD. The purpose of this course is to try to get you more familiar with ARCHICAD, and the first thing that I want to explain is the interface. Towards the top of the screen, we have the menu bar. All of the icons that you see on the screen, such as here and here, can be found in the menu bar. You will notice that one of the differences right off the bat is that Revit, on the other hand, is organized into tabs, as you see here. And although there may be some differences, there will also be aspects that feel familiar, such as the fact that icons are used in both of the programs to help identify different tools and settings. If you want to find something in ARCHICAD and you can't seem to find it on your screen, the first place you should look is the menu bar. I am now going to dive a little deeper into the different drop-down menus to give you a better understanding of how they work. The first menu that we are going to cover is File. Here is where you will find your typical project settings, such as New, Open, and Save. You will also find your printer and plot settings here, but when printing from File, you can only print the current open view. If you want to print or save file views in batch, you will have to use another method called the publisher, which I will cover later. You may also notice that there are a couple of different items found in the ARCHICAD file and not in the Revit file, like the libraries as you see here. For now, I'm actually going to go up to File, and I'm going to open the Library Manager. Just going to go over here and explain this a little bit so you can get a better idea of what we are looking at. And as you can see, we have a lot of different libraries that can be uploaded and linked with this specific project. Libraries are essentially different containers with all your objects and modeled elements. As you can see, we have the ARCHICAD library, MEP library, and an embedded library. Now, all the embedded libraries are specific to the project that you have open. So right now, I'm going to be clicking on the ARCHICAD library 22, and I'm going to be selecting this item over here to try to open up the library so you can see what types of objects and surfaces are loaded into this specific library. And this library comes default with ARCHICAD version 22, which is why the 22 is right behind it. If it was a 21 or older library, it'd be indicated with a different number at the end. Okay, so now my library has essentially opened up, and here you can see we have the object library 22, and that it is organized into different folders which are divided into the master format. I'm going to scroll down a little bit, and we're going to click on 12 furnishings right there, and we're going to be looking for the furniture library, 125000 furniture 22. Now we're going to just go to the seating and then chairs 22. As you can see, there's a variety of different chairs to choose from, and there's a preview of each of these different items that are inside this specific library. Think of this as a container for all of your components that are organized into different folders, instead of compiled into one ongoing list like they are inside of Revit. Now, your first piece of terminology differentiation is that component families inside of Revit are known as objects inside of ARCHICAD. And I want you to know that they do work very differently in both programs. I'm not going to go over it in this course, but Graphisoft does offer a training course to cover this content. Thus, when I'm referring to objects, it's really the same as components. So now that I've generally gone through that, I'm going to go over to this side here and minimize the object library and also open the surface catalog. Now here is where you can essentially find all your different built-in concrete textures as I've selected here, or really any textures in general that you want to use inside the project. These are really essentially images that have been imported so that you can use them in your rendering, and we do have a built-in renderer. The next menu that we are going to cover is Edit. Here is where you will find your standard commands such as undo, redo, cut, copy, paste. You will also find your modification commands here, such as move, align, and distribute. And speaking of move, I'm actually going to go up to where it says edit and down to where it says move to show you what is in this portion. And you'll see that we have this element called drag. Drag is the same as move inside of Revit. The shortcut command for this is Command D inside of a Mac, but if you were on a PC, that would be Control D. So you just have to get used to a little bit of using drag instead of move. But as you can see, essentially with these modify commands, it's essentially like the modify tab inside of Revit. And there are a lot of familiar commands here, such as grouping, under view. One is able to control how they want to see the element on their screen, which doesn't affect other people in the project. And the closest Revit concept to associate this with is temporary view properties in combination with the properties palette. And in the properties palette, if you essentially go up to visibility graphics and change it there, this is essentially a combination of that, but only because this is specific to the user. Now I'm actually going to expand some of the options to show you what I mean by this. So under View, there's a construction grid display. I am going to turn this on, and you'll see I have these little lines in the background right now. They're actually my guidelines, but the spacing is too far. So I'm going to hit View again, and then go to Grids and Backgrounds. You'll see that my spacing is every 1 foot. I'm going to change that to 1 inch. And then if you wanted, you can also rotate your grids. I'm going to hit OK. And now you can see a spacing of 1 inch on the back of my screen. And this doesn't print. Some people like them on and some people don't. I'm going to go back to View, and I'm going to turn this off because I personally don't like having it on. It's a little busy. And on the on-screen view options, you'll see that there's other options that you can go to change how things show up on your screen. Like the true line weight, for example, is also something that's a part of Revit. I like having them on. You can also control whether you can see your marker ranges in your view. What you really just have to do is go through the settings and see what you want on your screen. The Design drop-down menu is essentially the equivalent of the Architecture tab in Revit. You can find all your model element tools here under the Design part of the toolbox, such as your wall tool, your door tool, your window tool, your columns, etc. There's a lot of different items in here. Now, not only can you find them here, but if I go up to Design and Design Tools, you'll see all the icons over here under this drop-down menu as well, such as Object, which at this point we should know that is the same as a component. Now, I'm going to be going over the differences between the tools in both programs a little bit later in part 2 of this course, such as the magic wand and how that tool works. But while I still do have this open, I did just want to mention that stories in ARCHICAD are the same as levels in Revit, and that you edit your levels in the story settings dialog box. So I'm going to go up to Design, go down to Story Settings. And here are my story settings. And you'll notice that there's this little area right here with little check boxes. If the boxes are checked, then they will show up in your elevations and your sections. If they're not checked, they're more used like references, as this foundation and story working as well as my penthouse roof. Those are only going to be really reference stories that will not show up in my elevations or sections like these other ones are. You can also insert above, below, and delete stories in this location. Your typical Revit workflow was to essentially go into an elevation view and either draw or offset a new level. But you're going to be doing that inside your story settings dialog box. Like the design drop-down menu, You can find all the document tools to the left of the screen under Document. And this is essentially like the combination of both the Annotate tab and the View tabs inside of Revit. Here's where you can find all your different view settings, which I will go over in part 4 of this course. You will also find all of your drafting tools here under this Documenting Tools. Um, and you can, like in this area of the toolbox under Document as well. Um, you can also essentially create your sections, elevations, and interior views from this tool as well. You can see that there's a lot going on in this menu. You can also create different schedules and layouts here, and layouts in ARCHICAD are the same as sheets inside of Revit. You will also find your rendering settings here underneath Creative Imaging. And I'm going to go there right now, Creative Imaging. Here's your photo render projection, as well as your photo rendering settings. ARCHICAD has a built-in renderer, so you don't have to use credits to render on the cloud like you would inside of Revit. Graphisoft does offer a course on rendering if this is of interest to you. So options is where one can customize all of the elements in their model, like fills, line types, and all the other information that is going into the parameter component. It essentially has the I in BIM and is like the Manage tab inside of Revit, as well as a few other things. I did want to note a couple of differences between materials in both programs. So ARCHICAD has a surfaces and building materials category, whereas Revit only has materials. Surfaces in ARCHICAD work similar to um, materials inside of Revit, but it doesn't have any materials data. Surfaces are very superficial. So I'm going to go up to Options and open up the surfaces from right here. And surfaces are associated with different rendering engines. You'll see I'm going to just select on that's probably a fine surface to just work with. And as you'll notice in my view, you can have a surface color, you can have a vectoral hatching assigned to the surface, and here is the texture, which is essentially a JPEG image representing that. In this area, you'll see that we have these different engine settings, and right now it's set on the basic engine. There's also OpenGL, which is what you typically see in the 3D interface of ARCHICAD, and there's also CineRender by Maxon. And this is really the rendering textured interface that you're going to see when you want to render the surface. Surfaces are very superficial, as I've said, because they don't have any materials data associated with them. I'm going to close out of this and I'm going to go to Options and down to Building Materials. Building materials, on the other hand, are more complex. Each element has the following components associated with it. You can see the building elements that I have on the left of my screen. I'm going to select on ceiling acoustical tile, for example, and you'll notice that it has a 2D fill component. This is what the building material is going to look like if you cut it in section. And as you can see, you can customize what it's going to look like. And this area right here is essentially the 3D surface texture in the 3D interface. And you can also customize that as well. And this is based off the surfaces that were in the previous palette that I just showed you. Now, another component associated with these building materials is the intersection priority. And you'll see that there's different priority levels. Airspace has the least priority, and when I scroll down, it scrolls down to the most priority. And essentially, these higher intersection priorities will override other materials that have lower intersection priorities. Revit materials, on the other hand, don't really function this way. And this is why the building materials are more complex inside of ARCHICAD, and the reason why we have this, so that your intersections can definitely clean up. So for now, I am going to go down and hit cancel to close out of this. So essentially what you will do with these building materials is use them to create different composites. And as you've noticed, we do have a composite category inside of the options drop-down menu. And here is where you're going to be creating all of your different assemblies that are in the project. So what you'll see is this is my composite dialog box. When I expand this area right here, you will see that I have a floor composite, I have roof composites, wall composites. It's really all the composites that are in the project. And you create that in this list right here. Now you'll see that there's this wall chase right here, and there's 4 icons around it. Well, those are the different tools you can use to associate this different composite with, versus in Revit, where you essentially had to create the composite each time with each specific tool that you needed to use. So if you were to create a composite with the wall tool in Revit, you'd have to make it once, and then if you wanted the same composite with the floor tool, you'd have to make it again. So as you can see, I have the icons on the side right here. So there's the shell, roof, slab, and the wall composite. So now you can choose what to use any of these composites with. We're going to make a new one. I'm going to hit the new one, and let's call this test composite and hit OK. So first thing we're going to do is we are going to change this core material, which is currently masonry brick. You'll see a fill right here, which represents it. And next to it, we have what the surface is going to look like in 3D. For right now, I'm going to expand this, and I am going to type in metal and find this metal light frame and insulation graphic. I'm going to select that, and you'll see that my 3D has changed, and so has my 2D. Now, it doesn't look super great in this 2D, but it will automatically adjust the insulation that shows up in your view. So now that I have that, I'm going to change the dimension to 5.5 inches. Okay, great. So now you'll see that the total inches will update on the bottom right where I have my cursor. So now that I have that, we're going to insert a skin and add other layers to this composite. You can see it added it to my screen. I'm going to select on this right here, going to expand it, and I will type in JIP because I want the inside of my layer, which is on the bottom, indicated right here. This will be 5/8 inch. As you can see, my total thickness is updating as I change these. And we have this type area right here, and I'm clicking, this isn't working. Oops, I accidentally closed out of that. So let me try that again. We're going to go to our composites, hit new. I'm going to name this test composite, hit OK. We're going to change this to metal light frame insulation graphic, change this to 5.5 inches, insert a skin, and then change this to JIP and change this to 5/8 inch. Okay, so I'm trying to open this. Let me expand this to see if I could change the type, which is going to be important. So just wait a second and bear with me. Okay, there's this little icon that you can essentially choose whether the type is going to be part of the core, the finish, or other. So in this case, it's chipboard, so it's going to be finish. And this is going to be important for your view settings later called partial structure display that I'm going to go over later in this course. So now that we have set our type and our dimensions for these specific layers, I'm going to select on this again and I'm going to insert two more skins. This one, I am going to change this to air. Select that. You'll see that so I'm going to change this to 1 inch. Oh, I'm actually typing in the wrong spot. Um, that's not correct. There. Okay. I'm going to select this, change it to 1 inch, make sure that's other. As you can see, it updates on the side right here. And then I'm going to change this building material to, let's do granite. I'm going to type in granite right here. It's 1 inch thickness and change the type to finish. Now, not only can you just change the building material and how it's going to look in 2D and 3D, as you can see right here, if I were to essentially select on any of these lines that you see right here and my arrow is pointing to that, I could change um, the line style and the line pen associated with that here. And so I just wanted to show you essentially that you can really customize what it's used with, how it's going to appear in 3D and 2D as well. So now that we have that in our project, what I'm going to do is we're going to reference this later in a little bit, but it's great because you don't have to remake all your items for each individual tool. Instead, you could just reference it here, and when you update your composite type here, it'll update in the rest of your project just like a typical BIM project would. And it's very simple. Teamwork is like the collaboration tab inside of Revit, which essentially allows multiple people to work in the same project simultaneously. But the project does need to be on the BIM cloud in order for teamwork to actually work. I'm going to be going over teamwork in a little bit more detail soon. So, Window is where one can customize their user interface and control their tabs. Window is just like the View tab inside of Revit. So as you'll notice, we have this area called Toolbars and Palettes. If I go up to Window and Toolbar, you'll see to my right, there's a whole bunch of little essentially options that show up. And these actually have many icons and tools that you can use that will show up in the standard toolbar, as you can see where my marker is right now, my cursor. If you are ever wondering what an icon is, just hover over it, and this is trim, for example, and a little box will appear. Now, if your little box had essentially brackets with text in it, that is the shortcut to activate that tool or that icon. So over here, I'm hovering. This is the measure tool, and the shortcut for that is M. That's essentially what I wanted you to understand about the icons. Now, there's also palettes inside of Window. And palettes are like tools, but with more information that you can add to your work interface. So I'm going to go down and add quick options, for example. And you'll see that it's been added to the lower left hand of my screen, or right hand of my screen. And these actually have all of the different view settings that are on this specific view, which I will be going over in part 4 of this course. But essentially, what you can do is very easily customize your work interface to how you would like to work. ARCHICAD is very adaptable. Here you can see that I have a little marker that has showed up telling me I can extend and change my toolbox so I can see text or just icons. I'm going to change it back to just having two icons because that fits better to how I have my presentation set up. But I just wanted to let you know that the work environment is very adaptive. And lastly, we have the help menu, which is actually pretty self-explanatory. And what you do, like you do just in Revit, is you would type in what you would want to help on. So if I go to help and in search, I type in walls, you'll see that it'll tell me, how to find a specific setting and menu in the walls category. Now to the left of my screen, we have the toolbox. And I've been mentioning this a little bit, but essentially, um, this is like the architecture tab in Revit, and the design portion is where you're gonna essentially have your architecture tab. You're gonna find your elements such as walls, doors, windows, columns, uh, etc., your objects, and when you go down to the document tab, for example, this is where you're going to find all your annotation tools like your fill, your lines, your polylines, your sections, your interior elevations. This is a quick way to access all of these things that are essentially the equivalent of the annotate tab and the view tabs. Now, you may have noticed that there's this area right below the standard toolbar that changes as I select on different tools or different elements. This area is called the info box. And just think of this like the properties palette of Revit, where you can find information on the selected tool or the element in the view. Now, I'm going to select on the wall tool, for example. And you'll see in my info box, it looks like the wall tool or info box is incomplete, but to show the rest of the information, all you have to do is hover over the info box and then scroll with your scroll wheel to expand more information. All of the different tools that you're seeing to the left have different amounts of information shown on them. And so I just wanted to show you how to get the rest of the quick information that you would like to see. Now, this is a quick way of seeing information on your screen, but to get to the settings of the selected tool, there are three methods that you can use. In your info box, you can click on the icon, which will open the wall settings. I'm going to hit cancel. You can either double click on the icon from the toolbox, which is another method, and I'm going to hit cancel. And the method that I use the most is when the icon is selected over here or any of these icons, I'm going to hit Control T as the shortcut to open up the wall settings. I am a shortcut person myself, so I use this all the time. And on a Mac, instead of Control T, or Command T, it'd be Control T. Now, speaking of shortcuts, there's a list of shortcuts that have been included in the terminology list, but you can also find shortcuts by doing this. You go up to Options, you're going to go down to your work environment, and you'll see that there's a keyboard shortcuts area. When you select on that, there's a show shortcuts list in browser. And when you select that button, it showed up on my other screen. I'm going to bring it in. Here you will get a list of shortcuts that you can essentially just print and use as reference, which I think is great. So I'm going to close out of this. And also, if you don't like how a shortcut is working, you can also select on the element and change how the shortcut works here. Now that I have covered the basics of the info box and how to get into your settings, I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into one of the tools. I currently have my true lines on, and you could turn them off if you wanted to. I prefer them on, and that's one of the reasons why it looks so thick. But I'm just going to turn them back on because that's my preference. And the lines actually aren't that thick. It's just that we're really close to these items, which is why you're seeing it this way. So as you can see on my screen, we have three different wall structures, as we call it in ARCHICAD. The first wall is the basic wall, and there is no need to create a new wall type for this basic wall, like one would do inside of Revit. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the wall settings by hitting Command T. You may notice that there's an icon here, and here is where you will select the building material to associate to this wall. You can see there's a variety that you can choose from, and then not only do you choose that, but you indicate a thickness for that wall. This is great for SD, before you even know what your wall types are working with. You could even slant and taper your walls if you want. We are actually in the default wall settings. So once I place a wall, this is what it will show up as. But I'm going to select on this wall right here and hit Command T. And here you'll see wall selection settings. This is how I know that I'm editing the element that I'm selecting. So right now the wall type is set to exterior material. For now, I'm just going to leave it at 6 inches, and let's just change the slant, just for the fun of it, to 95 degrees. I'm going to hit OK, and you'll see that it changes in my floor plan view, and pretty soon I will show you what this looks like in 3D as well. So the second wall composite, or second item I wanted to go over is the composite wall. Now this is essentially like all the composites that we created under option composites. And essentially it has all the different layers and building materials that you can use inside of the list. So to show you how I got here, I'm going to hit Command T, select the second icon, and when I expand this, you'll see that everything that was associated to that wall icon will show up right here instead of a list of all the composites in the project. I'm just going to hit cancel. And lastly, we have this complex wall. Now, the last wall is more like a very powerful wall sweep inside of Revit, where different profiles are drafted and then extruded. And I will be showing you how this works very soon. I'm going to hit Command T, and when I select on this icon, you'll see that there's a lot of different profiles that are already created that you can use inside of ARCHICAD. And I want to show you how it is essentially created very soon. So before I show you complex profiles, which is the next item that we're on, I do want to show you what the walls look like inside of the 3D perspective. And as you'll notice, we have a basic wall right here, and you can see the different complexities of each of these walls, with the basic not having any layers in between them. There's our composite. So right now, I'm going to select on our basic wall, and I'm just going to change the slant so it's a little bit more visible in this view, like 75 for example. And now you can see that there's a completely different slant to my wall. And that's something that's not very easy to do inside of Revit. And you know that you originally had to create a wall type for that. So right now I'm actually just going to make my wall an 8-inch wall. I'm going to choose a heavy frame wood timber horizontal material to apply and make sure that my wall is straight. Now I'm going to hit OK. And it was really as simple as that to change my wall composite of my basic wall. Instead of, like I said in Revit, you'd have to make a wall type for a 6-inch version of this wall versus an 8-inch version. Really the basic is for when you're doing schematic design and don't really know what all your composites are yet. So something else that I wanted to show you essentially is why intersection priorities are going to be so important. Like as you see in this wall, for example, you'll notice that you can see all the different layers in my wall, which in 3D, which you wouldn't have seen inside of Revit. In Revit, you'll only see even your composite walls as a singular mass. So now that I've gone over that, I want to show you why the intersection priorities are going to be so important. So I'm going to select on this wall right here. I'm going to hit Command E, Command E is rotate in this case, and I'm going to rotate this wall 90 degrees to intersect with the composite wall. So I'm orbiting, and as you can see, here's my heavy timber mass. It's intersecting with my composite wall, and as you can see, the sheathing is still there. Whereas the other components it went through. And this is because of building materials and their intersection priorities. This is the reason why it's going to be very important, because it controls how your different layers clean up. So if I select both these icons or these walls right now and go to building materials, you'll notice at the top there's this little icon right here. If I press it, it brings all of my materials in use that are selected to the top of my dialog box. And here you'll see that wood sheathing has the highest priority over heavy wood framed timber, which is why the essentially wood mass is not going through the wood sheathing, because it wasn't programmed to do so. And this is just one of the reasons why intersection priorities and making sure that your building materials are correct is going to be so important. Now I'm going to select on this basic wall, for example, and now I'm just going to change this to be a composite wall, and I'm going to select the test composite that we had created earlier. Now when I click off, you'll see that my metal insulation layer, for example, cleans up really well, and that's just because it's the same material. The granite also goes through. It's stronger than the gyp and the exterior siding, which does that. And then, it looks like the wood sheathing on the other wall is still stronger priority than the other, or intersection priority than the other walls. So essentially, this is just one thing that I wanted to go over, which is going to be a little bit different from Revit. So now that I've generally gone over that, I'm going to zoom out and show you, here is our complex wall, which is our third item right here. So when I select on this wall, you'll see that this is actually one item, versus in Revit, to create this, it probably would have been multiple items extruded together that you might have used the wall sweep for. You don't need to use that. And essentially you can model very complex items inside of ARCHICAD with the complex profile. So I'm going to right click, go to edit selected composite profile, and it's going to open another interface for me, which was used to essentially draft and create that profile. Here we have the profile manager palette that shows up, and I'm going to zoom into this area a little bit so you could see that it's literally just fills that I used in order to create that extruded wall. This one is concrete cast building material that's essentially filled. If I expand this over here, you can see there's my other fill materials, building materials that I can use. This one is essentially a wood pressure treated wood, and this is a wood light frame material. As long as I choose different materials or building materials that I created with the fills, it should extrude correctly when I'm creating the wall tool or using it with any of those different items. So now that I've shown you that and how simple it really is, you'll see that you can use this profile with different tools and elements in the ARCHICAD as well. Like it can become a beam, a column, a railing, or even a library part. It's really flexible as to what you want it to be, just like your different composites. I'm just going to leave it at wall right now. There's a new function actually added to version 22 to make these complex profiles even better than they were before. And that's just so you can essentially give them extra adjustability with these modifiers. I'm going to type a new modifier called footing depth, hit OK. And right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit this little plus button here, and I'm going to select the edge, essentially, right here where I want it to move. And then I'm going to click on a point. I'm just going to make sure that's correct, that it essentially adjusts from. So it tells me that my footing depth is 8 inches right now, and that it can actually move to 12 inches or anything. The edge that I have selected will be the one that moves. I'm going to create another modifier called footing flange. Hit OK. I'm going to hit the plus button so I can tell it what to associate that modifier with. Select this edge, make sure you see right here there's a little arrow that shows up. When that arrow shows up on both sides, it says that it's going to basically stretch in both directions and not the one. I only want it to stretch in the one, so that's what that circle means, is that it's locked in that location and that's how it's going to move. I'm going to press this button again so I can get the other side. I'm going to click on it right there, move it up to this location. And now that we have these essential modifiers, I am going to hit the save button. And I'm going to close out of the profile manager because we don't need it anymore. And in my 3D view, you'll notice that I have these blue lines around my complex profile, specifically my wall. And that means I can modify these. I'm going to click on an edge, and this is my pet palette that appears. I'm going to click on this icon, and I'll go in the pet palette a little bit more detail. But when I do that, you can see how that bottom of the footing depth is going to stretch. So I can essentially type in a number like 12 inches, hit enter, and it will be my 12 inches that I want it to be. If I select the flanges, for example, you can see that it can also adjust on the screen. I could type in 6 inches and it will automatically adjust. If I hit Command T, there's also a profile offset modifier, and you can adjust the dimensions from there. And as always, there's also a profile modifier that is added to the info box that you can also use to change these dimensions. There are multiple ways that you can essentially adjust this to make it work the way that you would like. And I just think it's really amazing because this is all drafted. So the next item that I wanted to cover with you all is the slab tool. On my screen to the left of the walls, you see right here, we actually have a slab in my floor plan view, which is kind of hard to notice. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the settings of this slab in order to essentially make it more visible. So I just hit Command T to open this up. And under floor plan and section, you'll see that there are these options that you can go through in order to essentially make it look the way you want visually inside of the plan. So you'll see over here, we have this cover fills portion, and that's essentially the surface that you're seeing right now that's uncut. And what we're going to do is we do want our cover fills to be checked, and I am going to uncheck use fill from surface to override the cover fill. I'm going to select on airspace right here, and I'm going to type in concrete, and we are going to look for a concrete surface texture vectorial fill to apply. Concrete surface is fine, and if you wanted to, you could change the pen type. I'm going to hit OK, and here you can see now essentially a surface that we've applied to better identify the slab. So now that I've basically gone over that, I do want to go over another tool, which is called the Magic Wand. And the Magic Wand tool, let's make a new slab, for example. I am going to make sure I select on the slab tool. And what you'll notice is when I hit the space bar button and hold it down, there's a blue outline that shows up, whether it's the outside of the wall or the inside of the wall. And that is essentially going to be the extents of my slab that I'm going to be creating. After I click down, it says that my layer of the slab is not visible. So I'm going to go back down to check my settings. And here you can see my layer is not visible in this specific view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change it to a different layer to associate with the specific slab that I am choosing. And let's just set this to the default ARCHICAD layer right now. I'm going to hit OK. Then I'm going to hold down the space bar, and I'm going to click on the exterior of the wall. And that should now be a slab that is inside of my model. And soon I will be showing you what this looks like in 3D. It's a little funky. Now that I finally have the 3D part of my perspective working, you'll see that my slab isn't here, so we can just as easily place it in by doing the same thing with the space bar, hitting the slab tool, and right now it's set on tile and mortar. I'm going to change the assembly to floor concrete plus 4 inches of gravel. And here you see we've just very quickly added um, a slab in 3D, just as quick as we did in 2D. And with the magic wand tool, which Revit doesn't have, I can just as easily even add the walls to a slab. So right now, I'm going to select on the wall tool. I'm going to hold down the space bar, and right now, I'm just going to show my layer to make it visible in my view, and I just clicked. So here, you can see my walls that I'm selecting them right now. And if you pay close attention to the walls, you'll see that right now the top of my wall is not linked. I'm just going to change this dimension to about 3 feet, so it'd be easier to see in this specific view. But what you'll notice is that there's the dark blue lines, and this is actually the reference plane. And right now, the reference line location of the wall is the outside face, but it isn't the outside of the slab. So to fix this, we can either press this button right here or hit P to essentially flip the direction of the walls to where they should be. And now my wall is in the correct location that I want them to be. We can do the same thing with the roof tool as well, essentially. Um, this is probably fine as this roof shingle material. I'm going to go into multi-plane geometry, and I'm just going to change the offset right now of the overhang to 1 foot, hit OK. Now that I have that, I'm going to hold down the space bar, click on the exterior of the roof or the wall, and then click. And you can see I very quickly just created a roof with the click of a button in the magic wand tool, which is why I think it's so great. So now that essentially we've gone through that, I'm going to select on these walls to the left, and I'm going to delete them. Because not only can we use the magic wand with these tools, but we can also use the magic wand tool with railing, which is, I'm going to just select it right here. I'm going to just change this to the ARCHICAD layer so I can see it on my screen, and you'll see that you can create a static version or an associative version of the railing, which will adapt or not adapt to your slab. So there's this little arrow right here. It's called favorites, which I haven't gone to in much detail yet. But favorites are essentially types that you use over and over again that you can get to for quick access. And all of these tools have a favorite. So right now I'm holding the spacebar button and I'm clicking. I am going to change the layer from stair to ARCHICAD layer. I'm going to hit OK. And here you can see that I've quickly just created a railing in my view. Just going to orbit a little bit to give you a better idea of what we're doing and what that looks like. So essentially, since I've gone through that and showed you the different ways of the magic wand working, I am now going to select on to this roof that we had created. And that's just because I want to show you the pet palette. And for right now, as you can see, I select on the reference plane or reference line, and this little box appears. This is the pet palette. It gives me all my modification options, and the options will be a little bit different depending on whether you click on a node or an edge. Right here, you see the custom plane settings, and this is specific to the roof tool. So I selected this icon, and by default, it's set to pitch. If we want this side to be gable, all I have to do is select gable and hit OK. And now we have a gabled side, and I'm going to do the same thing to this other side, change this to gable and hit OK. So, it's very quick to also change the slope of the roof and change this to 4 inches. I'm going to hit OK, and it just very quickly adapts. This is why I really like the roof tool as well. I can also change the offset super quickly. And as we know, the roof tool isn't the best inside of Revit because you need to know what we are creating ahead of time. I'm going to hit Command T and open up the settings. As you see, my side is like this pink color that I don't want it to be. So there's a model option in which I can override the surface. I'm going to select this right here to override the side, type in white, and I'm going to look for this whitewash and hit OK. And now visually in 3D, I have changed the surface and its appearance, even though the assembly and composite is exactly the same as how it was before. So right now, what I'm doing is making sure I'm in the slab tool and selecting my slab. And earlier I said that the railing was associative. So I want to show you how that will automatically adapt. I clicked on an edge of the slab. I have the insert new node and I'm just going to pull it out. And you'll see that my railing has changed automatically to change with that. And all I did was go into pet palette. So if I select on a different edge, I'm going to click on this plus button. And right now, what I'm going to do is essentially just add essentially to my slab so that the edge will expand. Um, that's not exactly doing what I want. I'm going to just draw a box essentially in order to add that. It's not working exactly as I have imagined, but before I forget, I did want to mention that um, floors and ceilings are the same as slabs inside of ARCHICAD. I'm actually just gonna have it subtract from this space. And I did want to let you know that one of the differences between ARCHICAD and Revit is slabs do work a little bit differently. There is no dedicated opening tool for slabs. And so what you have to do is make sure that you are in this subtraction, you draw your essentially the opening, and then you will have a hole in your slab. That is a little bit different from what you're probably used to. And just know that there's no dedicated tool for this like there is inside of Revit. So now you should have a general understanding of the pet palette as well as the magic wand. The one last tool that I wanted to cover is teamwork, where multiple team members can work on the same project at the same time. This would be the Revit equivalent of the collaboration tab. When one makes changes in ARCHICAD, they send and receive, which is the same as synchronize with Central in Revit. There's also a messaging function where one is able to communicate with others, as you can see on the image on my screen. ARCHICAD's teamwork differs from collaboration in that users in the project are assigned associated roles, which are then assigned varying levels of permissions and access. As you can see towards the left of my screen where I am, we have roles such as architect, draftsman, lead architect, and viewer, etc. You can add more roles when they become pertinent to the project. Then, when you select any of the roles, you have to go through and assign different levels of permissions and controls. The great thing about this is that if you are ever have an intern or something and they're learning what the program and how to use it, for example, they wouldn't be able to accidentally change something that they shouldn't. And it could impact everybody else in the project. So now I'm going to open up the Teamworks palette by going up to Teamwork and then Teamwork palette. Here you can see some of the different settings that we have available to us. And essentially, there's this area right here. It says Color Workspace. Right now, it's at with all original color, and that's what you're seeing currently on my screen. All the users that are in this project are assigned different colors. You can see that Sally Struck is this yellow and Sally S is red. If I go to the color spaces and change it to Show Reservation By, you'll notice that essentially this area right here is reserved by Sally S and it's in the color red, so it's easily identifiable. If I wanted to reserve elements, everything in blue is reservable. So I'm going to select on these three items right here and then hit reserve. Once I do that, you can see that it is the color that I am right now, which is that little orangey yellow, and it's reserved by me instead of Sally S. All of the elements in blue are available for reservation. When you hover over anything that has a different color, you'll see who the element is reserved by. If it just says editable, then that is reserved by you. The great thing about this is you can see who is working on what and when. Another item that I wanted to go over about teamwork in ARCHICAD is that people with higher permissions have the ability to essentially kick other users out of the project. And I want to tell you about a personal experience I had at my last architecture firm, which was a Revit firm. There was a person that we were working with in a different remote location, and we had a next day deadline deliverable, and somehow she reserved every single thing in the Revit model. All 8 of us were in the model, and we were freaking out because we couldn't do any of the work, and she had left for home that day. Um, so when we finally got in contact with her, she was stuck in traffic, and by the time she actually got back to the office to synchronize her computer, we had wasted 2 hours waiting for her. So can you imagine actually just wasting 16 hours of billable time because 8 people had to halt work and then do overtime to make up for a mistake that is essentially something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. This is why I like ARCHICAD's ability to essentially assign permissions as well as kick people out of the project. And the last item that I want to go over in terms of teamwork is that you can also assign specific tasks through messages. So as an example, I'm going to select on this text right here. And in order to assign, um, first you actually need to reserve the element. So I'm going to reserve the element right here. I'm going to right click again, and then I'm going to assign this. And I could assign this to Sally S, for example. And once I do that, I'm going to say assign, and you'll see that it turns red. And that means that I have assigned this specific element or task to Sally S. If I wanted to in the previous box, I could have also added some text as to what I wanted to do. I just closed out of the teamwork palette. Actually, I'm just going to change this back to with all original color and continue with the rest of this course. So that was it for tools. We are now going to go over the navigator, which you can see on the right side of my screen here. Think of this as the project browser of Revit. And generally what you'll find here is all of your views, your legends, schedules, and sheets. There are 4 different icons in the navigator, as you can see up here. And we are actually currently, as you can see in my navigator, in the view map, which is like the Revit equivalent of views. I'm actually going to explain the view map first because it's a little bit easier to understand than the project map. You will see that we have this project views folder, and I have organized all these other views to basically place into it. Like I said, this is like Revit's equivalent to the views in their program. What I like about the view map here is that you're able to essentially organize all these different views into a file folder structure that is easier to understand instead of trying to, filter them all differently inside of Revit where you can only find floor plans, for example. You can actually set up different types of floor plans to organize that into very easily by just dragging and dropping it into different folders. So now I'm actually going to expand my project views again, and I'm going to expand the elevations folder. As you can see, we have a variety of different elevations. I'm going to double click on the south elevation right now. And that's just because I want to show you, um, the different views and why they're different from views in the project map, which is the previous icon. These actually have specific view settings applied to them. So as you can see on my screen, we have this elevation. You can see all the different pen colors associated with this elevation on my screen. Right here, these are the quick settings, and these are the actual view settings that I'll be explaining later that are applied and remembered by each of these specific views in the view map. Views in the project map, for example, don't actually remember any of these settings. It's like the base or source. So now what I'm going to do in order to show you how it remembers each of its settings, I'm going to select this other view that's the black and white version of this. So I'm going to double click and wait for it to generate on my screen. And as it's essentially loading, you will notice that pen sets, which I'll explain a little bit later, that this is actually a black and white version of the elevation that we had seen before. And that's because it remembered the specific view settings applied for this specific view. So the reason why I was actually explaining this first and the views from the view map is because the icon that actually comes before this, which is the project map, it is a step that really Revit doesn't have. It has essentially all the sources and the source views in order to create views into the view map. It's essentially the base, and everything in the view map is essentially the little bullet points or contents in it. So if you're in the project map and you have an elevation, think of that as chapter 5, and everything in the view map as 5A or 5B or 5C. I'm going to go into the project map so you can get a better idea of how this is actually working. So you can see here's my elevations. I'm actually going to double click that to open it into my screen. Everything that's in the project map is actually the source for the views in the view map. It probably doesn't look like anything has changed, but I'm definitely in a project map view right now versus a view map view. So I'm going to be explaining why in a little bit, how I know that this is actually a project view and not a view from the view map. But not only can you essentially think of this as the base of your project, but you can also think of this as your working view because these don't have fixed view settings applied to them like they are inside the view map. So for right now, if I change this to my colored pen set, it's actually not going to stay as the colored pen set if I go on to a different view. This is why I am saying that it's kind of like a working view inside of Revit because their working views never really go on sheets. A majority of your time is actually going to be spent in the view map versus the project map. I just wanted you to basically understand what the project map is. One more quick item that I wanted to cover in the navigator is this area right here called stories. These are the sources for both your floor plans and your RCPs inside of ARCHICAD, and that's just going to be a little bit different from what you're used to in Revit. In Revit, they have both a different floor plan interface and a RCP interface. In ARCHICAD, you're going to have the same source, and essentially when you create the view into the view map, you are going to have to assign them to different layer combinations, such as a floor plan layer combination or an RCP layer combination. It's just going to be a little bit different from what you're used to. There is a way to actually create an RCP with a 3D document tool, but I'm not going to be going over it right now. I just want to let you know that it does exist and there's a way to do it. As mentioned a little earlier, I was going to explain how I knew that I was in a project map view versus a view map view. And you'll notice that we have these tabs up here. ARCHICAD has a tab interface, whereas Revit has a Windows tiling interface. And you'll notice that my icon right here is black. And the other icons and tabs are blue. Everything that has a black icon is from the project map and is essentially your source. If it has any blue icons, then it is actually from your view map. And that's how you quickly identify that by just looking at your tabs and your icons. Now, another way to tell if you're in a project map view or a view map view is everything that is in the parentheses or brackets is actually a source view. And if it's outside, like this one navigator, that is the name of the view itself. Everything in the brackets again is the source view that it's coming from. And that is a quick way to tell the difference between where you're working. A majority of your time will be in the view map. While I'm still in the view map, I do want to go over something that ARCHICAD has that Revit doesn't really have. And that is an item called worksheets, which is located in the project map of the navigator, as you can see right here. And for now, I'm just going to select on it. Here is where you can place all of your independent sources and bring them into your project. Think of worksheets as your drafting environment, like drafting views are to Revit, but in our case, you can do a lot more than just create details because you can also layer them on top of each other, and I'll be teaching you about trace reference pretty soon, which is a workflow that ARCHICAD users use. So we're going to create a new worksheet. For right now, I don't care too much about the reference ID. I'm going to delete that, and we're going to name this test worksheet and hit create. So after we've done this, it's going to open up essentially a worksheet for me that's independent of the rest of the program. And for right now, you can do a lot of things. For example, I'm actually going to bring in a PDF into my project, which I know it's not possible to do inside of Revit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my Finder, which essentially shows me what's on my desktop, and I'm going to look for a PDF source like this Milgard Windows PDF that I have. There's multiple pages in this, and it's as easy as actually just dragging and dropping the PDF file onto my sheet. ARCHICAD will then ask me, which sheet do I want of this PDF? We're going to select 16 and hit place. I'm going to move this out of the way. And now you'll see that I have a PDF placed into my project. Now, it's great to have this PDF and you can use it as reference, but you can also make this usable elements. And I want to show you how to do that right now, because there's lots of PDFs that you can use to make details that manufacturers essentially create, like this one. So in order to make this more usable inside of ARCHICAD, what we're going to do is right click and go down to explode into current view. Then I'll get a dialog box that essentially asks me, how do I want the explosion to convert? For right now, I'm just gonna change the uniform pen to something red so you can see the source view versus what it's gonna become, and hit OK. So now you see I have this red stuff on my screen. Those are actually ARCHICAD elements, and I'm gonna move my original source to the side so you can see them and compare them right next to each other. You'll see that I have individual elements that I can select on, and I am just going to clean up this by deleting all the elements that I don't want and just clean up this essentially detail a little bit. But these are all ARCHICAD elements and details that I can then use as part of my construction documents. And it really is as easy as that to bring in your PDFs and make them usable. Not only can you do this with details, but you can also bring in your different floor plans, JPEGs, different file formats in here, use it as reference, and then we'll be essentially going over trace reference a little bit later and what that means. So for right now, I'm going to go into trace reference to explain that to you. I am just going to go into a floor plan view to give you a better sense of trace reference. So earlier I mentioned that ARCHICAD doesn't have a Windows tiling like Revit does, and so I wanted to show you a workflow to help adapt to ARCHICAD. And essentially what you see here on my screen is a floor plan. And if I wanted to see the south elevation, all I have to do is I would go into essentially my project views, expand my section or elevations, right click on south elevation, and go to show as trace reference. What's going to happen is towards the bottom of my screen, ghosted a little bit, you'll see the south elevation in my view. Now, in order to be able to essentially get more settings to manipulate what I'm seeing, we do have essentially when you go to, there's an icon in the uh, standard toolbar, which is this icon right here. This is the trace icon. And if you press it, you can turn it on and off. There's this little arrow right next to it. And when you go to trace and reference and select that, it's actually going to open up the trace and reference palette. I just expanded that a little bit so you can get a better sense of what's in this. And so right now, if you wanted to move the location of your south reference because it's not in the correct location, there's a lot of stuff that you can do, a lot of little icons. So I just hit this little button right here, and this essentially allows me to drag and move my reference to a different location. I'm just going to drag it back just so the grid lines align. Now there's also an option in which you could change the reference color. I could change it to red, for example, so it's more easily identifiable. There is a lot that a person could do with trace reference. And what I really like about trace reference is this icon right here. What it does is it essentially switches what is active and what is the reference source. Now, this only works between a reference and an active. Uh, this doesn't work with all the different views if you're using trace reference. So as you can see on my screen now, I have the south elevation, and above now as my reference is the floor plan. So if I select on this door right here, for example, and I delete it, you'll notice that it's actually going to be gone from my south elevation, but it hasn't necessarily updated in my first floor plan yet. And so there are times where you actually just have to hit this icon right here, and it will rebuild the reference to match the what currently is on your screen in order to update. So there are times where it doesn't update automatically. So that's what you would have to press in order to do so. Versus in Revit, if you were to select that and have all your different windows open, they would all simultaneously disappear. So I'm just going to switch my reference back to the first floor plan. Just wait for it to load a little bit. Now you can even use trace reference with any view in the project. It can even be a worksheet. As an example, I'm going to expand my floor plan views, and I'm going to look for my fourth floor roof. And in order for me to use this as a trace reference, I'm going to select it first, right click on it, and make sure it says show as trace reference. So now you can see that my reference of my fourth floor roof is on my first floor, and you can see where all the essentially where all the roof is sloping to my downspouts that are going into the building, as you see right here. Now, a neat tool that I wanted to show you is this icon right here. It's called the splitter. And so if I select this and turn it on, you'll notice that there are these little arrows towards the ends of my graphic screen. So if I click and hold down on it, essentially I can drag and go over specific areas of my view, so I can see what the reference is and how it compares to the active source. So you could do this with your different levels, different floors, your different ceiling plans. I'm just going to turn off trace reference right now and close the dialog box. You can see that this is like a more powerful version of Revit's overlay and underlay. And that's just because whereas in Revit, underlays and overlays only work for floor plans and RCPs, you can really do this with any view or sheet inside of ARCHICAD. So to go over what we've covered so far in the Navigator, we've gone over the project map and the view map, as you see right here. You use elements in the project map to create views in the view map that have specific settings applied to them that ARCHICAD remembers. And the next component after this is the layout book. Now, you're going to be placing your views from your view map into the layout book. The layout book is where all your sheets are. And this is going to be very similar to what you're used to in Revit, where essentially you take a view from your views and then you would essentially drag and drop that into your sheet. So this isn't going to be a very different workflow than you're used to. Right now, I'm going to double click on this elevation sheet, and as it's loading, you will notice that there are 4 elevations on this sheet. And again, this isn't going to be that different from what you're used to inside of Revit. All you would have to do is go up to your views and then drag and drop that onto your screen, as you can see on my screen here. As this is still loading, I'm actually going to be scrolling down a little bit in my layout book, and you'll see that there's this area here called masters that essentially grayed out. Masters are the equivalent of title blocks inside of Revit. They aren't essentially that different at all. And I notice I don't really have the title block set up that I want to in this specific sheet. So what I'm going to do is I am going to go back up to where I have my building elevations, select that, and then just change the master sheet to this ARCHICAD NCSGS. And now you can see my title block on the side, or in this case, masters. It's exactly the same thing. Now, to show you how the masters work, it works very similar to how they work inside of Revit. I am going to scroll down to the bottom of my masters to find the master that I'm currently using on my screen. It's ARCHICAD NCSGS. I'm going to double click on that and zoom out. And you will notice that there's all these different lines essentially and text on my page. This NHS office complex, for example, if I change the name of my project, it's going to update automatically. I know there's ways to do that inside of Revit as well with smart text. That's essentially what's happening here. You'll notice that there's these grids on my page like F7 to F1 and this A7 and so on. Well, these actually represent grids and they don't print. I'm going to go back to my original sheet. And what I wanted to show you is if you zoom in, or I zoom in, you'll notice that all of these drawings that I brought in have a very specific detail number associated with them, and that was due to the placement of where they were located on the sheet. So in this case, everything on the bottom left-hand side of my drawing was going to be the detail number, which is why you see A1 on this side, the C1, E1, and this E5. Now, I think this is great because you can be very consistent about detailing, especially if maybe you don't use a detail number later, it would just be empty. If you do happen to want to change the arrangement, like let's say I'm going to go back into settings. This is the align and drawing settings to grid. I'm going to select on this button, and this is how the grid is set up. I'm going to switch the direction of the numbers, hit OK, and you'll see that the numbers instantly change. Now, going back to my drawing, you take a look and you'll see that the details, the numbers have changed according to the bottom left-hand side of the detail. So this is now A7, and I think this is just great because you do get the option to use this or not use this and manually just change your detail numbers as you see fit. The last thing I wanted to go over in the layout book is automatic sheet numbering. I'm going to make sure that I have the A2 elevations subset open, and what I'm going to do is hit the new sheet button. Here you can see that I'm going to create a new layout called test. I could change the master layout if I want to any of these other masters. Let's select the master that I created before, and you'll notice that it automatically changes it to the next number in the sequence. I'm going to go to A sections, or A3 sections for example, hit the plus button again, and let's name this test. in the sections, and you'll see again that it's going to automatically change to the next item in this sequence. If I had deleted the A307, then this would automatically change to sheet A307. Whereas in Revit, you know that the sheet numbering is based on the last sheet number that you created. So you can really have some jumbled numbers. And how it works is essentially here, you'll see that there's a custom ID that's associated with the folder. And you'll see that the custom ID assignment is set for the different subset elements, and we can see a preview right here. So currently this is locked. You can change it, but that's how I have it set up for this project. And the ID styles we can also change. Um, as you could see in my preview, there's a 0 in front of each of these. If I expand it, I can also change it to being different letters and hit OK. And that's how it can just automatically update and essentially create these sheets and number them automatically for you. Again, to reiterate, in Revit, the next sheet number created would be based on the last sheet number that you created. So if you were jumping around and creating sheets, it would typically be super jumbled. Whereas in this, you just select the folder and you create some rules for the essentially the subset to create and number your sheets correctly, which is why I think this is super great. Now, this last icon right here is the publisher. And this is where you're going to be compiling all your different sheets into different sets for batch export, whether it's going to be in a PDF format or all your other formats. On my screen, you can see that this specific set is set to layouts for PDF. And I essentially just drag a few different folders and put it in. You can export it as a DWG to IFC. There's a lot of formats that you can publish to. So here we have this ARCHICAD PDF that has folders in it. What I can do is I can also create a new folder called, actually instead of test, I'm going to call this electrical sub sheets. And the reason why I'm making this folder is it's very easy to actually take other folders that you have and drag the sheets in. So you can essentially just create different sets to export to who you need it to, or different sheets to move out to who you need to. So this ARCHICAD PDF right now, if I select on the folder, you see that I can export just the selected items, the layouts in the current issue, or even really the entire set. That's why I wanted to show you this. I want to make sure it's only what I am selecting. And so if I hit document options, you will see that I have additional options to choose whether it's just color or black and white. If I go up a level, you can actually create different publishing sets. You want to make sure that in the settings, you always set a file path that it's going to go to, and essentially understand where it's going to save. I'm going to browse right now and actually save this to my desktop, and the format's going to be PDF in this case. I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to double click and open this. And let's say I wanted to just export the plans, elevations, and sections, everything that was in these folders. I'm going to make sure it's just the selected items, and I'm going to hit the publish button. And here you'll see that I'm publishing all those different layout sheets essentially that were in those folders. And this was created essentially just by dragging and dropping into these different publishing folders. So essentially, as we're waiting for this to complete publishing, um, again, the publisher is great in order to export in batch versus if you go to file and print or file plot, that really only is for the open view. And what's also great about the publisher is, you can see the file structure and what it's going to essentially print in batch very easily. Whereas in Revit, you had to go through a list of all the sheets in the project and different views and make sure you had to check each boxes for the sheets that you wanted to export. and create a set of. And that's a very long list to go to. And it's not very fun to manage. Whereas, you only set this up one time, you update the sheets as you go, and it always remembers which sheets that you want to export with which batch. So taking a little bit of time, or about 11 out of 15 done. And so once this finishes publishing, I'm going to try to open up this PDF so you can see what that looks like. So now that's done, I'm going to hit the close button, and I'm going to go off to where I can essentially see the desktop and look for that file. It's called, has PDF in the end. Let's see. This is the file, and oh, there's a lock sign on it. So I want to show you how essentially to fix that. So now that I know that that PDF is password protected, there's a few things and settings that I want us to check. And essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I go up into my settings. I'm going to layout booked PDF. And I just want to double check the publishing properties first. Format PDF. Everything looks fine. I'm going to hit OK. And I am just going to go back and double click on the layout book. I'm going to make sure I select on the folder and go to document options. So there is actually a PDF options, and saving it with color is fine. I'm going to expand the PDF options, and you'll notice that it says require password to open the document. I'm going to uncheck that and also include product info in PDF. You can also change this screen resolution if you want as well. I'm going to hit OK and OK again. So now that we've kind of corrected that setting, I am only going to want to print maybe the plan and elevations, for example. It's not going to be as many sheets. And now I'm just going to double check it's just the selected items. I'm going to just expand these. Actually, since I just created the A to B test one, I want to make sure I select all the plans and only this A2 building element, because the A2B test does not have any content in it actually. And so I'm going to hit the publish button and wait for that to load. And I do want to let you know that if you do create a single file and a single PDF file, all of the essentially markers are linked as long as you print the sheet. So here I'm going to go back and open up my PDF. You'll be able to see a little preview of that sheet. There's no longer a lock symbol with it. And so here's essentially the preview of that, and you can see that it's working. So now what I'm going to do is let's open this up into a PDF viewer. I'm going to do so by double clicking on this. This is Bluebeam. I'm just going to wait for it to load on my screen. Okay, so as this is loading, you'll see in my thumbnails, the last one is the elevation sheet. And since I do have elevations, hopefully I can find the markers that are associated with each of these elevations, and you'll see that the grid backgrounds did not actually print. So I have a little finger button right here that's a pointer. I'm going to see if it actually connects me to the elevation sheet, and it does. And that's just one of the benefits if you actually export this as a single PDF file with multiple sheets versus just exporting them out as individual sheets. If you do that, this is not a possible option unless you do the linking inside of Bluebeam, for example. Okay, so I'm just going to move this out of my view. And now that I've gone through that and showed you the basics of publishing, you can see we're back here in our publishing set. And remember, we did make this electrical sub sheet set, And I wanted to show you how easy it is to essentially take the drawings and essentially create different sets in order to export to who you need to export to. So how you do this is you go up to, let's say, the foundation plan, and the first floor plan is all I want to send. All I have to do is select those and drag it, drop it into my folder. When I let go and expand it, you'll see that it's the exact same sheets. And if I made updates to them, it's going to update both of that. It's just that I now have a set that I can send to a different consultant with the type of information that they want to see. I could do this as many times as I need to, instead of just going through a giant compiled list like you would have to in Revit, and then make sure you go through all the sheets and turn on and off carefully what you're seeing. I'm just gonna go back to my view, and I'm just going to go over the rest of the view settings, which is part of part 4. So you may have noticed that towards the bottom of my screen, there are some icons that I haven't gone over yet. Well, these are the different view settings that you can have applied essentially to the views that you have in your project. The first view setting that we're going to be going over is layer combinations. And here are my different layer combinations to the left. My current view combination is the default 3D for this specific view. And where here you can see that these are all the different layers that are turned on and off for a specific layer combination. In this case, I have a lot of different layer combinations that you can choose from. With the layers itself, you can also control what the layer name is, if they're visible, if they're essentially locked, or if they're going to be wireframe. So these are things that you're going to have to be cognizant about, and it's a slightly different workflow from what you're used to, because Revit is an element-based system, whereas ARCHICAD is a layering-based system. So all these tools and elements that you're seeing right here, all of them need to be assigned a layer. And so that's just one extra step that you're going to have to choose. If I click on this right here, these are my different layer combinations. And for right now, I'm just going to select IFC, stair, and structure so that you can see what this looks like in my specific view. And you'll notice that a lot of the different layers are turned off. So here, you'll see that, like I said, a lot of the layers are turned off. So I'm going to hit cancel. So again, to reiterate, one of the most important things to note about how ARCHICAD and Revit differ in workflow is that ARCHICAD is based on a layering system. So one controls visibilities by assigning different elements to different layers and then assigning those different layers to layer combinations. Revit, on the other hand, is a element-based system which controls visibility through visibility graphics. In Revit, one is able to hide an entire window category or individual selected elements in that view. In ARCHICAD, the visibility of windows or doors, for example, cannot be controlled individually because they aren't assigned to a layer. The wall or element that they're embedded in is assigned the layer. So this means that if the wall is hidden, all of the embedded elements in that wall are also hidden. One of the benefits of the layering system is that you can have different modeled elements on different layers that aren't specific to a family. So I'm going to open up the object tools, for example, and I'm just going to expand furnishings, and let's look for a chair, seating, chair 22. So now that you can see we have a whole bunch of different chairs in the project, we always have to make sure we assign it to the correct layer. As an example, you can see whether if I assign it to this specific layer, if it's going to be visible or not. This is going to be super important because you're not going to want a chair to show up on a roof, for example, or all of these different items or different layer types that you don't want them to show up in. I would say that one of the biggest workflow changes is remembering that you always need to assign an element to a layer. And so it's an extra step that you didn't really have to do previously that you're going to have to do now. Now, when I change this layer combination to IFC structure and stair from my default 3D, you may have noticed that there's this area right here that has basically a little hazard sign on it. And the reason why I'm explaining this to you is because we are in a view from the view map. So it has specific views and settings, or not views, but view settings applied to it. Right here it says default 3D, and our current view says it's IFC structure and stair. And so it currently does not match. So if you were to go to a different view and off of it and go back to this view, it's going to go back to default 3D because that is the setting applied to this specific view. Now, if you wanted this essentially to update to your IFC structure and stair, what I would do is select on the layer combination, make sure it changes to IFC structure and stairs, and hit OK. It's the same thing with the other settings in the project. All of these views in the view map are assigned very specific view settings. The next setting that I wanted to go over is partial structure display. And that is essentially this icon down towards the bottom of my screen right here, right next to the layer combinations. And in some cases, you might want to only see certain structural elements, and this is where you control that. I'm going to select without finishes, for example, and wait for this to update. And as this is updating, I was going to click through the other settings. And as you can see, if I had actually set up the essentially the composites correctly, more of these finishes would probably disappear. If I go to core only, this is going to switch to only showing my core elements that were assigned that specific structure during the composite creation. And you'll see in this case, most of it is that metal framing insulation, which is showing up here in your screen. And so, you know, I just want to basically say that Revit really doesn't have the ability to show you all these individual parts of the composite at different structural levels. And not only can you see this in 3D, but you can also see this in 2D inside of ARCHICAD. Typically, Revit just reads the wall assembly as being a whole element, whereas in ARCHICAD, individual building elements are taken into consideration. Another important setting to understand in ARCHICAD is pen sets. There isn't really a Revit equivalent for this, and so it will also be a slightly new thought process to adapt to. Think of pen sets as layer combinations, but instead of controlling visibility, you are controlling the line weights and line colors. You'll notice that I have two pen sets down here in the project. One is for model view, one is for layout. If I press them, I can change how I'm seeing the different line weights in my view. Now, if you're wondering how these are set up, I'm going to hit on this icon right here. And right now, you'll notice that, each of these different items in my view are assigned different elements. The top row, I would essentially say don't mess with it. You'll see that this number 6 pen set is assigned to all door swings. It's okay with changing everything below that. I would recommend keeping this the same. But if you do happen to want to change this, I am going to show you what the implications are. So to start off, why don't I just change the pen weight to 1? And as you've noticed up here, it says that it's a custom pen set. If you do any changes, if you want to keep this, you have to hit Store As and make a new pen set. I am actually going to change the color of this pen, let's say orange, for example, and hit OK. when I hit OK again, you'll notice that everything that's considered a door swing will change. And it's not only in this view, but it's going to change in a whole bunch of other views if you've assigned essentially the custom pen set or any other pen set to that. I'm now going to just change it to my default ARCHICAD model view. And that's just to give you a basic idea of how this works. Um, the great part about this is it can very quickly help you identify different elements in your project while still printing normally. The next setting that we're going to be going over is called Model View Options. This is like a more powerful equivalent of the detail level from Revit, like where you can control whether it's fine, coarse, medium. Here you see it's set to construction documents detailed. I'm going to just change it to schematic design, for example, and you'll see that my doors has simplified in this specific view. The skin separators of walls are controlled a little bit differently. It's graphic overrides, and I'll be going over those in a little bit. But essentially, that's what I wanted to go over in terms of model view options. If you want to understand how this model view option is set up, we're going to select on this icon right here. And now, if I expand this construction element options, you can see whether I can essentially control whether each of these doors or elements show up with their markers. Essentially, uh, whether they're going to show up in this specific model view option. Down here is what you're used to probably seeing inside of Revit, where you can essentially control the level of detail for your doors and your windows, like full, medium, and low. You can do this exact same things for doors, and then essentially you can just assign, these elements the way you want. Another tab I wanted to go over was the curtain wall tool, and ARCHICAD version 22 has been updated so that you can actually, in this little preview, control whether you see your frames or different components of your curtain wall and as to what detail you're seeing each of those at. So there's a lot of customization that you can go through for each of these different model view options. This is just something that you're going to need to take a look at and set up. Our next setting to understand is graphic override combinations. This is kind of just like graphic overrides and visibility graphics in Revit, but it uses rules to create overrides instead. And what you can do is really all up to your imagination. And this isn't even really specific to just this view. You can also do it on sections and elevations. I just turned off my combination override. So this is actually the default of what's happening. You'll see that my zones have appeared. If I go to simple drawing, you'll see that my line separators are all gone. And this is what I wanted to show you before. I'm going to just turn off my thick lines a little bit so you can see how it actually is gone from this view. Um, it's really all up to your imagination as to how you want to do this. Let's see, if I select site plan, no drafting fill, I was just going to go through a few of these different settings to see how much they change. But if you really want to understand how graphic override combination works, I'm going to go over that very soon. We are going to make a new one where essentially maybe all our objects, for example, are red. So I'm going to go into my graphic over, I'm not in the correct icon. I'm going to close out of this. Okay, so now we're in the graphic override combinations. And right now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the new button and we're going to make a new combination called red objects. And actually, I'm going to add a dash to that. So red dashed objects. I'm going to hit OK. And essentially, I can add any new rules. There's no rules right now. These are the rules that are already populated in the project. I'm going to make a new rule, and I'm just going to call this red dashed objects. And I'm going to go to edit rules. You'll see right now that my element type is not specific to objects. So you could set the criteria right here. In this case, I just want it to be my objects as the criteria, and I'm going to override the line pen type. I'm going to make this red, and then I'm also going to change the line type right here. Instead of solid, I'm going to change that to dashed. And now that I have that set up as one rule, I'm going to hit OK. And I can always add more, but I'm going to hit OK. And as you can see, I now have red dashed objects in my view. You can get very specific as to what you're overriding and add other items, such as if you didn't want to see the skin separators, if you didn't want to see the zones and you wanted to see through them, you can add different combinations as you go. This is me just very quickly trying to show you how the graphic override combinations work. You can really do a lot with these different settings. The next setting that I'm going to go over is renovation filter options. And this is just like phases inside of Revit. There's an existing phase, a demo phase, and a new phase. So I'm just going to click on existing phase right here so you can see how that's set up. If I go to demo plan, you'll see that it looks different on my screen. Let's go to after demolition. You'll see that all those demoed items are now gone, and then there's project completion that also has all the new components and the existing element components. I did want to mention that one isn't able to create additional phases like they can in Revit. There's only the existing phase, demo phase, and new phase. As with all BIM programs, you want to make sure that the elements in the model have been assigned to the correct phases so that they will appear correctly when you turn on your renovation filters. And you can see the different statuses and how they show up in your current view. As you saw, I already cycled through a few of the different filters. This last setting here that you see in the 2D interface is dimensions. And as you see, we don't actually have any dimensions in this view. So I'm actually going to very quickly add some dimensions with ARCHICAD's auto dimensioning. And what I'm going to do first is marquee this area that I want to affect. I am going to select all the walls in this area, and I am going to essentially go up to document and go down to exterior dimensioning. As you can see, you can tell ARCHICAD how you want to auto dimension. I only want the overall dimension in this case, and I want it to dimension the openings, and I want it to dimension to the center of the openings versus just the opening endpoints. I'm going to have it place it on all of the sides right now, and I'm going to hit OK. Now, you're probably wondering, what do I do next? Well, at the bottom of my screen here, if you're ever wondering what to do, this will tell you what your next step needs to take. And in this case, it's telling me I need to select on a reference point. So I'm going to select on this wall. And then the next point is to essentially determine the inside dimension point. And when I click, here you go. You automatically see my dimensions show up. Now, if I selected on this dimension and I know it's not working correctly, I want to make sure I'm in the dimension tool. And when I actually hold down the command option, you'll see it'll add extra points to dimension 2. And this one, let's say I don't want it there, I'm going to select on that dimension point and delete it to clean it up. So it's really as simple as that in order to do dimensioning. But I'm actually going to go into the dimension settings because I want to show you that based on this, you can actually select different ways to view your dimensions. Right now it's at the building scale. I can show it at the enlarged scale, which changes my my rounding. I can go to millwork and details, which changes it to inches. And then I can change it to US Architect, which changes it to the nearest 16th of an inch on my sheet. And so to show you essentially how it works, I'm going to click on this icon to open up the preferences. And here you can see if I want to display the zeros for my linear dimensions, my angular dimensions, my radial dimensions. You're just going to have to go through each of these settings in order to control how you want each of your dimensioning to appear. You'll probably only usually use one. Now, the last setting that I wanted to go over is actually specific to the 3D interface, and that is called 3D styles. This is like the graphic display options that you'd find at the bottom of your Revit screen. I'm just gonna click on this right here so you can see all the different options that you can choose through, and I'm just gonna cycle through a few of them so you can see how they're set up, like wireframe, for example. You see there's a lot of lines going on here, so maybe you might not necessarily want to use it. I'm going to select this and go to the next. Let's see, which one do I want to choose next in order to see? Let's choose simple shading. Just wait for that to show up. Here you go, there's just simple shading and simple colors in this specific view. For the next one, I guess I'm just going to wait for this to load for a little bit. But as it's loading, maybe the next one, I'm just going to use this white model with shadows. And as we're waiting for this to appear, you can always change the shadow angle and how you're seeing all of this in 3D. And so essentially the last thing I'm going to go back to is my simple shading option with shadows. Here you go. To change it back. Just wanted to show you there's a variety of different settings that you can go to in 3D. I know that we have reviewed a lot of information today, and in order to try to be as helpful to you as possible, we have the Help Center that you can go to by typing in this link that you see on my screen, helpcenter.graphisoft.com. So essentially, with all this information that you've been receiving today, hopefully you'd have a better understanding and general grasp of how ARCHICAD works, especially in terms of the Revit background. We appreciate you taking the time here today to be here with us, and I hope you have a good rest of your day. Uh, my recommendation in order to learn this program is just to take your time and explore and learn the buttons. That's really the best way to learn. So thank you again for attending this course.